Great. Welcome. We have a crew of about, I don't know, maybe a dozen of us here in Junction, and Isaac has a pretty good crew down there in Montrose. So, not going to spend much time introducing you, but basically, really appreciate you helping us out in the West Slope here, Joe, and let you kind of take it away.
All right, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be
It's
with
a
you
pleasure to
tonight,
be with you
and
tonight, and
hopefully be able to
hopefully be
share
able
some
to
things
share
that
some things that
will help you
will
in
help you
planning
in
some of your
planning
pasture
some of your
management
pasture
and your
management
pasture
and your
stewardship.
pasture stewardship.
When
When
John and Isaac
John
first
and
asked me
Isaac
to
first asked
speak
to
tonight, they
speak
gave me this
tonight,
big
they
old
gave me this
laundry
big
John,
list
old
of
excuse
laundry
things.
list
me.
of
John, you need
things.
to
John, you need to
mute your mic. Thanks.
Got it?
You heard it was feedback. Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
better. Thanks.
All right. So they gave me this whole laundry list of things to talk about, and it's like I don't think we can cover that in 30 minutes. So we kind of narrowed it down, and so tonight we're going to kind of start with that upper picture there, talking about what do you plant? There's a whole slew of different species out there that you can plant, and a lot of them have good positive things and some negative things associated with them. So we're going to talk about some of those things, and hopefully you at the end you'll be able to pick some species and end up with a pasture or a field that looks like that bottom picture, where you can provide some good high quality forage for whatever type of animal that you might be trying to feed. So again, one of the big questions we always get as extension agents is, what do I plant? We get those kinds of calls all the time. So again, there's numerous grasses and legumes out there to choose from. You go to the internet, you go to the catalogs, and there's just this big laundry list of species. One thing I wanted to just say up front is there's no miracle plants. They really don't exist. Those plants that are going to produce 5 tons to the acre with no water and no fertilizer. Those plants don't exist. We see these things come across in the popular literature all the time that sounds like it's going to be the miracle plant. But again, there's a lot of good plants, but no real miracle plants out there. So what you should plant really kind of depends on your goals. What kind of animal you're trying to feed. Is it for grazing? Is it for hay production? You're trying to do a little bit of both. Those types of things you need to kind of consider up front. Now you're going to have some limitations on what you can grow. The soils. There's really not much you can do about the soil type that you have on your particular property, but it's something that you need to understand and to consider when you think about what you're going to plant. Second thing is water availability. Water is the most limiting factor here in the West, and if you don't have irrigation water, then there's a whole different type of species that you're going to have to think about for more of a dry land or maybe a limited irrigation situation. And then your environmental constraints. Are you in the lower valley where it gets hot during the middle part of the summer, low humidities, lots of evaporation, those types of things? Are you a little bit higher elevation? You get cooler temperatures and you get good plant growth in the middle part of the summer. So those types of things you need to consider. So one of the first steps that I think you need to consider up front is to get a soil test. And when you get that soil test, you're going to get a lot of information back, but the ones I have listed here on the slide are what you really need to consider. pH. Most of our soils in the western west slope are going to be high pH, around 8 pH, a little more on the alkaline side. Your soil texture, that mix of sand, silt, and clay. If it's a sandy soil, there's only certain species that'll grow in a sandy soil. If it's a really heavy clay textured soil, again, only certain species will grow in those types of environments. Most species like more of that good mix of sand, silt, and clay, more what we call a loam. Your organic matter content. A lot of your soils in the west here are low in organic matter, 2% or less. But that's where a lot of your nutrients and your water holding capacity is in that organic matter content. So if you plant a perennial pasture, you will start to build that organic matter content over time. The big one, I think, on the west slope is the salt content. A lot of your soils over there that you're dealing with in the Montrose Delta, Grand Junction area have fairly high salt content. So that's your soil test is going to tell you how severe that is on the particular field that you're trying to establish. And then your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We don't typically have to worry about potassium in the west. Nitrogen is almost always going to be limiting. So one of the big ones you need to look at on your soil test is the phosphorus levels, because it's important for both grass production as well as legume production. So I first started out here with a some just things to kind of get you thinking, I guess. What, some considerations. First is cool versus warm season grasses. And just as the name implies, the cool season ones grow in that springtime period, and then they'll start to grow in the fall. You can kind of see down here on this little graph that, we've got the cool season here, kind of in the blue line, grows in the spring, a little bit of a summer slump during the hot part of the summer, then it'll pick up back in the fall. Our warm seasons, they're going to not grow as early in the spring. They're going to put on most of their production and growth in the middle part of that hot summer. So my general recommendation is for most applications, you don't want to mix these. From a practical standpoint, it looks like maybe you should to get kind of that even forage production over the whole growing season. But the warm season plants are just not as palatable. They're always going to graze the cool season before they'll graze the warm seasons. Again, there's differences in the timing of the production. It just makes it very difficult to manage. So if you want to try to grow some warm seasons to kind of augment those cool season plants that we normally plant, I recommend that you plant about 70 to 75% of your land area to cool seasons and about 25 to 30% to those warm seasons. And it's just easier to manage. Then we have the bunch versus the sod forming grasses. The bunches, just as the name implies, they grow in a nice little compact bunch, just hundreds of tillers growing in that bunch. And then the sod forming ones have these, what we call a rhizome, basically an underground stem. And those stems have these little nodes or growing points on them. And periodically along that stem, they're going to produce a new grass tiller. So there's, probably the common sod forming grass that most people are familiar with is Kentucky bluegrass that we grow in our lawns. So especially when we're putting pasture mixes together, I like to mix the two together. The bunch grasses tend to be a little more productive. Those sod formers can help to fill in some of those bare spots. The cow trails, around the water spots, you're going to have some bare spots. So one thing to think about is sometimes those sod formers can be aggressive and can kind of push out some of those bunch grasses or the legumes in the mix. So your intended uses, is it for hay, grazing, or both? Some species like intermediate wheatgrass and timothy are better suited for haying. Some species, the low-growing species like Kentucky bluegrass and white clover, they just never get big enough to put in a hay bale, so those are better suited for grazing. Then you have a lot of them that are what we consider dual purpose, orchard grass, meadow brome. These work very well whether you're in a pasture situation or a hay situation. Then palatability. For grazing purposes especially, not so much in hay, but for grazing purposes, we don't want to mix species that have widely different palatabilities. A couple of examples, orchard grass versus intermediate wheatgrass. And you'll oftentimes see these two in mixes that you buy from the seed dealer. But I'll guarantee you that an animal will grub the orchard grass to the ground before it starts to graze that intermediate wheatgrass. Now, intermediate wheatgrass, if you plant it by itself or with, again, other species of wheatgrasses that are, have like palatability, they'll graze it just fine. Then, meadow brome versus the older tall fescue varieties. The tall fescue has, kind of a tough, fibrous leaf, and they just don't like to graze it when they have a choice of something else in the pasture. Height of growth is another consideration. You don't want to mix short and tall species, again, especially if it's a hay mix, because those short species will be shaded out. So there's no need to put again, Kentucky bluegrass or white clover in a mix that you're going to grow for hay production. Next consideration is the recovery rate after haying or grazing, and we'll talk about this a little more. I got some additional slides that kind of list some of these species, but there's species like orchard grass and meadow brome that are really conducive to fast regrowth versus things like smooth brome and timothy that just take a long time to regrow. So, especially pasture mixes, you want to kind of think about those things. Occasionally, we do mix these two together. Things like smooth brome, orchard grass, and meadow brome, that's a very common mix, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But not going to get much production out of that smooth brome during the middle part, that hot part of the summer. It goes kind of almost semi-dormant during that time period. Drought tolerance. Again, this is going to come into play, especially if you're under dryland conditions, a dryland pasture, or limited irrigation situations. Maybe you got some early spring water, and then by late May, early June, you're out. So There's a kind of a whole set of species of grasses that kind of fit that scenario. A lot of your wheat grasses and wild rye, they will fall into that category. All of your warm season grasses have more drought tolerance than your cool season, so they would fall into that category. A couple of legumes, sainfoin, we'll talk about that one a little bit later, and then alfalfa. Alfalfa is one of those really highly adaptable species that and we put lots of water on it, and we grow lots of tons of hay, but it kind of came from an area of the world where it had to survive severe droughts, and so it's very adaptable to dry land type conditions. Again, the big one I think for the West Slope is salt tolerance, and again, there's only certain species that kind of fall into that, and I'll give you a whole chart that shows a bunch of these different species. But again, the wheat grasses fall into that category, the wild rye, tall fescue, creeping meadow foxtail, those all have pretty good salt tolerance. One thing to think about is don't only test your soil, but your water as well, because a lot of times we're bringing salts onto the field with our irrigation water. So look at both parts of the puzzle there. Winter hardiness. Orchard grass is one of, again, worldwide, it's one of the main grasses that we plant for pasture and hay production, but one of its downfalls is that it can winter kill, especially when we get into those dry, open winters. A lot of the winters we've been having recently, we get those very fluctuating temperatures and then cold conditions, and it's dry, and soil's dry. We can oftentimes see winter kill on orchard grass. So I like to plant things like meadow brome that tend to be more drought and winter hardy. Then the last one there is the tolerance to high water tables. Some of you, I'm sure, are going to have situations where you have low spots in the field or low-lying areas where the water accumulates, you get saturated soil conditions, periodic flooding. And there's kind of a handful of species like the creeping meadow foxtail. We don't use reed canary grass much here in the West, but it is one that's adapted to flooding. Timothy, Alsike clover would be some potential species to use in those situations. So again, because of the importance of having species adapted to high salt contents, I put together this chart for you. Again, showing a number of different grasses, and then the ones in kind of the darker green are the few different legumes. But again, tall wheatgrass, again, a lot of people on the West Slope in your area have again, very high salt contents, and there's a lot of tall wheatgrass planted over in that country. And that's probably one of the most salt tolerant species that we have. It's not the best grazing species, but it is sometimes the only option you have for those very high salt content soils. And things like Russian wild rye, hybrid wheatgrass, they would fall into that tolerant. That's what the T stands for there. Then some moderately tolerant ones, the MT. Then we get to the moderately sensitive ones like alfalfa and orchard grass. That threshold number there, that is measured. That's what you'll get back on your soil test. That's the electrical conductivity of the soil measured in millimoles per centimeter. Basically, the higher the salt content, the more electrical conductivity that the soil will have. So the higher the number, the more salt. So the threshold is where you'll start to see about a 10% yield reduction in these different species. And then the upper limit is where you'll actually the plants will actually start to die. So in between that, the plants will survive, but they're going to be stunted and not as productive. So those are, again, some general overview of some of the things you want to consider when you're thinking about what you want to plant. So when you actually start to put together a mix, as a general rule, especially for the irrigated and the more intensive type pastures, you want to keep them simple. Again, think about every species in the mix. It should have a purpose. Again, thinking about some of those things I just went over. Generally, no more than about 3 to 4 grasses in the mix. And then if you're adding a legume, generally only one species of legume. Now, kind of the one common exception to that is if you're at high elevation, more of the mountain meadow type country, we often plant red and Alsike clover together. The red is a little less water tolerant. The Alsike is a little more like those flooded type conditions, does a little better. So we mix them together because you have drier spots in the meadows and wetter spots. So one or the other of them will take in those different areas. One thing to consider is if you're planting a new field and you anticipate a weed problem, you want to omit the legume so you can potentially use herbicides to control any broadleaf weeds. When we plant grass legume mixes, we virtually there are no herbicides, labeled herbicides that we can use when we plant grasses and legumes together. You always interseed that legume at a later time once you get the grasses going, and so they're competing against the weeds. So this is just a kind of a chart of kind of showing the seasonal productivity of some common perennial grasses. The top 4 are cool season grasses, and you can kind of see, again, that growth pattern of early spring growth, kind of what we call a summer slump in that mid part of the summer, hot part of the summer. And then once the temperatures start to cool off in the fall, we start to get a resurgence of growth in those cool season species. Again, but even within the cool season species, there are differences. Tall fescue starts really early in the spring, grows through that springtime period. As long as it's got water, it will continue to grow in the middle part of the summer, but again at a reduced rate. And then once you get to the fall, it starts to pick up again. Things like the intermediate and the smooth mediate wheatgrass and the smooth brome, again, early spring production, they again pretty much almost go semi-dormant during that hot part of the summer, and then start to regrow again in the fall. Orchard grass, again, this is one of the reasons we use orchard grass a lot. Good spring production, again, as long as it's got water, it suffers a little bit from that summer slump, but generally will continue to grow through that summer into that fall time period. The last 3 are warm season grasses, switchgrass, big blue stem, and Indian grass. And again, even within those, the switchgrass starts growth earlier in the spring, the big blue stem is middle part of the summer, then Indian grass is late summer, early fall. So planting those 3 together in a mix for a warm season mix, again, you get more of that longer season growth by planting all 3 of those together. So here's a list of species, very common species that we plant for pasture and hay production that have that more rapid recovery after defoliation, after they've been grazed, and they're more grazing tolerant. So again, it's kind of just a handful of species that we tend to use over and over again, and this is part of the reason. Things like orchard grass, tall fescue, meadow brome have very good recovery after grazing. These plants are continually putting out new tillers. You'll have some tillers that are flowering and producing a seed, and other tillers that are just initiating down in the bunch. So you got everything in between. So if they're grazed or hayed off, there's tillers that are just ready to regrow immediately. Then this group is, their buds and their tillers are very slow to recover. These pretty much almost have to get to that flowering stage before they initiate that new set of tillers down in that crown region of the plant. So, what we're seeing right now are tillers that initiated last fall in these cool season species. So those have to go through their life cycle before that new set of tillers will be initiated later this spring. So things like smooth brome, timothy, intermediate and pubescent wheatgrass. Again, these are slow to recover, so you have to manage these a little bit differently. Even things like alfalfa. If you think about how alfalfa grows, we harvest it about every 30 days, but it has to get kind of close to that flowering stage again before that new set of tillers or shoots initiates down in the crown of that alfalfa plant. There's just a couple of examples again showing defoliation sensitive, smooth brome, slow to recover, versus the orchard grass. It's not defoliation sensitive, has those tillers that are again continually initiating. And this is 3 days after each one of them was mowed. You see virtually no green leaf on the smooth brome, and we see an inch to an inch and a half of new growth on that orchard grass plant. So again, that's why we like that orchard grass as a grazing pasture plant. So with that introduction, I'm just kind of go through a couple of different mixes that I think might work on the west slope area over there, and then I'll talk about some of the individual species and maybe some other species that you might want to insert or consider inserting into this kind of this base mix here. So if you go to the seed dealer, most seed dealers are going to have what they call an irrigated pasture mix, and more often than not, it's going to have these 3 species in it: orchard grass, meadow brome, and smooth brome. So here you have orchard grass and meadow brome, which are bunch grasses, and then the smooth brome, which is the rhizomatous or sod forming grass. Again, you don't want a lot of that sod former in there, but I generally put about 10% or less of the smooth brome in the mix. Again, so you get a cow pie and you lose an orchard grass plant, that smooth brome will be able to fill that spot in without having to go back and reseed the pasture all the time. So again, in a pasture situation, I almost always put a rhizomatous sod forming species in there. Now when you go to a seed dealer, the one thing that they're always going to have these pre-mixes that you can buy, things they've already got bagged up, and they'll almost always have perennial ryegrass in the mix. And I really don't like that. And a lot of times I discourage people from buying those pre-mixes for that reason. They put it in there because ryegrass is very quick to germinate. It gives you a very quick green, and you think you got a nice pasture established. But the thing about perennial ryegrass in our environment is it's not very drought or winter hardy. So we tend, the first year it looks really good. Second year it might look all right, and then time we get into year 3 or 4, the perennial ryegrass has pretty much died out. So I actually ran into a producer that had a very nice field that he established. He called me the next spring and he says, "You got to come out and look. I think there's a bug or something that's eating my grass because half of it's dead." Well, it was because the perennial ryegrass came up, the other species in the mix didn't, and most of the perennial ryegrass winter killed, and so he had to basically go back and replant that field. So I try to leave the perennial ryegrass out of the mix if possible. So let's talk about some of those individual species. Again, the orchard grass. Very productive species, very palatable. Again, it's going to be one of the first things that animals will choose when they go to graze a pasture. Very long leaves, very palatable. Again, got quick recovery from defoliation. Again, if you got water in the middle part of the summer, you're going to get good regrowth. And the big downfall is it can winter kill in dry falls and open winters. Because orchard grass is one of the more common species we use, there's hundreds of different varieties out there, just kind of like alfalfa. Latar and Potomac are a couple of good varieties. They're older varieties, but they work very well over on the west slope. If you're more in a dry land, droughtier type or limited irrigation situation, this variety called Paiute is a little more adapted to dry land or limited irrigation type situations. The meadow brome, again, it basically looks like a bunch grass. It kind of can have these little short rhizomes, but it doesn't form the sod like the smooth brome. Again, very good pasture or hay species. Quality is very similar to orchard grass, recovers very quickly, very leafy and palatable. Again, good midsummer growth. The thing I like about the meadow brome is it's a lot more drought and winter hardy compared to orchard grass. Again, there's not as many, this species isn't used quite as much as some of the others. Regar is the old standard variety that we used to plant. The Canadians have worked a lot with developing meadow brome varieties. They have one called Fleet and one called Paddock that work very well. Montana released one recently called Montana. But the one I really like, and that's the picture here in the lower right of the slide there, is Cash Meadow Brome. It's a new variety out of Utah, and it just has very strong seedling vigor. It's very productive. I mean, barely skipped a beat in each drill row. I mean, every seed pretty much came up. So if you can find that variety, that's the one I would recommend planting as a meadow brome variety. The smooth brome, again, there's thousands of acres of smooth brome planted over the U.S. Again, this is a rhizomatous, a fairly strong sod former. Again, it fills in those bare areas. It does well under irrigation as well as pretty much dry land type situations. It's pretty drought tolerant. It's highly palatable, highly nutritious, high in crude protein, low in fiber, so animals really like to graze it in that springtime period. Again, probably one of its downfalls is kind of that slow regrowth, that poor summer growth. And it does require some additional nitrogen to kind of maximize its productivity. Lincoln is kind of the old standard variety. When we get into the higher elevations, we like to use this Manchar variety. It's not as strongly rhizomatous. It doesn't form that strong sod and becomes sod bound like that Lincoln variety. So that's the base mix. So here's some other species that you might want to consider adding. You could, like I said, 3 to 4 grasses. So that was a base of 3. So here's some other ones you might consider. Kentucky bluegrass. Again, another rhizomatous, sod-forming species. It's a better grazing species because of its low growing. But I'll often, especially for horse pastures, I'll recommend putting a little bit of the Kentucky bluegrass in there because it's very durable, very grazing tolerant, stands trampling very well. You can graze it down to 2 inches and it'll just bounce back. I mean, most people are familiar with it in their lawns. You mow it once or twice a week, and 2 to 3 inches tall, and it just keeps bouncing back. It's very high quality. It's all leaf material. Now there are a couple of what we call forage type varieties that are a little more productive than your lawn type Kentucky bluegrasses, and Troy and Ginger are a couple that fall into that category. Another one is a creeping meadow foxtail, and again, I think this is one that you might want to consider, especially for a pasture situation on the west slope. Again, this is another rhizomatous species. Again, kind of like the smooth brome, it's fairly aggressive, fills in bare spots very easily. I think it's a better grazing species than haying species. It tends to get kind of stemmy if you let it go mature and get to that haying stage. But it is very durable, and if you keep it grazed, it remains very palatable and very productive. One thing I like about this, again, it has moderate salt tolerance. So again, for those salty soils, as well as low-lying areas. This is one of your more wet-tolerant type species. Withstands long periods of flooding. I mean, soil can be totally in standing water for up to 60 days, and this plant will survive. It's really kind of a unique mechanism to pull oxygen out of the water through its root system. And Garrison is the common variety for that one. Tall fescue is one. Again, it's not as palatable as some of those other species, so if you mix it with the other species, they'll tend to graze like the orchard grass and the bromes before they'll take the tall fescue. So a lot of times I'll recommend tall fescue as a monoculture planted by itself. It is a bunch grass. Again, when it's planted by itself, animals will graze it readily. It's very durable in horse pastures. You can stockpile it for fall, winter grazing. Again, very productive species. The one thing you want to be careful about, especially with horses, is the older varieties can contain what's called a fungal endophyte, which produces an alkaloid that, for pregnant mares, horses aren't pregnant, and it's only in the last 60 to 90 days of gestation. You don't want to be grazing on tall fescue pastures that have the fungal endophyte, or feeding hay that has the fungal endophyte in it. So what they've come up with over time is the endophyte is actually transferred in the seed, so we can plant endophyte-free seed, and the field won't become contaminated with the endophyte unless there's a seed source coming onto that field. So there's Fawn and Alta. You can get those in endophyte-free varieties. There's a lot of newer varieties of tall fescue out there that are fine-leafed and developed for grazing, a little more palatable than some of the older type varieties. What's really kind of cool is in recent years they found that what's called a novel or friendly endophyte. The endophyte, it gives the tall fescue plant, resilience, drought tolerance, resistant to insects and diseases and those types of things. So if you don't have the endophyte in it, the tall fescue tends to die out fairly soon. So they found this novel or friendly endophyte that gives the plant all of those good characteristics and longevity, but it doesn't produce the alkaloid, so it's safe to feed to both cattle and horses. So developing more and more of those varieties. Max Q is the one that's available right now. So those are some species to consider for irrigated type sites. So again, if you're into limited irrigation and again saline, salty type sites, here's a potential mix. Intermediate and pubescent. A lot of the wheatgrasses have good salt tolerance. You'll see mixes that contain both of these. These are very similar type species. The hybrid wheatgrass is one that has almost as good a salt tolerance as the tall wheatgrass, but it's a lot more palatable. And the Russian wild rye, again, a good pasture species with good palatability. Again, depending on your salt content in your soil, you can substitute tall wheatgrass for the intermediate and pubescent. But again, the tall wheatgrass is not as grazing tolerant, and it doesn't tend to be quite as palatable, but it does have that very high salt tolerance. So again, intermediate pubescent, these are kind of mildly rhizomatous species. They don't sod bind quite as bad as the smooth brome. Fairly drought tolerant. They work really well under limited irrigation situations. Kind of a moderate salt tolerance, not as high as the tall wheatgrass. They don't tend to be quite as palatable as some of those other cool seasons. The orchard grass and the bromes are not near as palatable. So again, I don't like to mix them with the bromes and the orchard grass. Again, you need to have, because these are defoliation sensitive, slower to regrow, it's best to rotationally graze these, and you're going to have to use longer rest periods to allow that regrowth to come. The pubescent variety, or the pubescent form, competes very strongly with weeds and is a little more aggressive, drought and winter hardy compared to the intermediate form. Wahi is a good variety of intermediate for the west slope. and Luna is the main variety of pubescent that we use. Hybrid wheatgrass, this is kind of a unique plant. It's a cross between the native blue bunch wheatgrass that grows throughout the western United States and kind of that intermountain region over there, and quackgrass, which is, most farmers consider quackgrass to be a weed, but because it's strongly rhizomatous. But these are two wheatgrasses basically that they've crossed, and they ended up with a plant that is, excellent productivity under saline soils, has good drought tolerance, works very well under limited irrigation situation, and it's not as doesn't form those really tight sods and becomes sod bound. And it also retains its forage quality late into the season. And of all the salt tolerant grasses we have, this is going to be one of the more palatable ones. Again, works very well in a grazing situation. And New High is the only variety that's available of that species out there, of that cross. Russian wild rye, this is a big old bunch grass. Again, forms these big old clumps. So it's not very suited to haying, but it is a very good species for grazing. Again, very drought tolerant, so you can use this under dry land conditions or limited irrigation, down to about 12 inches of precip. Again, highly tolerant of saline soils. Again, just about as tolerant as the tall wheatgrass. Very palatable, very nutritious. Probably the big drawback to this one is it's kind of slow to establish. So it takes a while. It takes 2 to 3 years for it to really become fully productive. A couple of varieties, this Bozoyski Select or the Bozoyski 2 are both very good, very similar type varieties out there. So some other potential species for limited irrigation, saline or dryland sites, crested wheatgrass is a bunch grass. Again, very drought tolerant. This is one of the most drought tolerant cool season grasses that we have available. Provides very early spring grazing, good palatability, poor summer growth though, unless it's irrigated. High Crest and CD2 are a couple of good varieties that I really like. And this last one I listed here is called AC Saltlander Green Wheatgrass. And I've never worked with this one personally, but I've been reading a lot about it. The AC stands for Agricultural Canada, so this was developed in Canada. It was brought over from Turkey, and again, a very salt-tolerant species. Again, it's going to be up there with the tall wheatgrass, but again, it's going to have a lot better palatability than the tall wheatgrass. So I think there's a company in Oregon where you can actually get this seed. I want to just finish up here with talking about a few legumes. Why consider adding legumes to a mix? Again, improve your forage quality, particularly your crude protein levels, increase your yields by adding legumes to a mix. And probably the big one in this day and age is to reduce, as those legumes fix their own nitrogen, reduce your nitrogen fertilizer needs. So potential legumes, again, thinking about maybe adding one of these to some of those mixes. Alfalfa, most people are familiar with alfalfa. Very adaptable from dry land to fully irrigated, compatible with most of those species I talked about. Probably the big drawback is bloat potential, but again, if it's mixed with the grass at about 25 to 30% of the stand, you don't typically have a lot of bloat under grazing situations. It is moderately sensitive to salty soil, so it's not going to be as salt tolerant as some of the other species. Bird's foot trefoil. This is a non-bloating legume, so it works very well for pasture. Its drawback is it's slow and hard to establish, but once you get it established, it's very long-lived, holds its forage quality very well. It's going to be slightly better in salt tolerance than alfalfa. And the Norson variety is the one that I really like. It's been planted all over the U.S. and does very well in all types of environments. All different types of clovers. Most of these are moderately sensitive to salty soils, but they're easy to establish. Again, nitrogen fixation, improve that crude protein content. Alsike, the top picture there, is the most wet tolerant legume that we have, but you want to be careful. You don't want to plant this for horse pasture or hay because it does contain a compound that can cause liver damage and photosensitization in the animal. And this is, especially the liver damage, is an irreversible. There's no treatment for that. Again, avoid the Alsike for horses. Red is a better species for hay, but it can be grazed as well. We typically use the mammoth type variety in the higher elevations, the mountain meadows. That's the single cut variety. Then we use the medium, what's called the medium red clover, which is the multiple cut. And we use that for both hay production and grazing at some of the lower elevations. For grazing, the white clover, it spreads by stolons, just kind of like a strawberry does, very high in nitrogen fixation. Typically use what we call the New Zealand or intermediate type growth. In strawberry clover, this is one that most people aren't familiar with, have never maybe even heard of, but it has a growth form a lot like the white clover. Stolons, short growing, more of a grazing type species, but it's going to be one of the most salt tolerant legumes we have out there. So again, pasture situation on the west slope, this might be one you want to consider. Sainfoin, this is another non-bloating legume, extremely palatable, high sugar content, can be short-lived, needs well-drained soils, doesn't like its roots to be wet, does very well on high pH, the alkaline soils, but it doesn't like salty soils. So high pH, but no salts. It's one I do recommend if you're trying to draw wildlife into your property. Deer and elk, they just love this species because of the sugar content. So there's this Remont Esky and Renumix. Those are some of the older varieties. There's a couple of new ones, this Shoshone and Delaney. Delaney is out of the University of Wyoming. It's adapted to our environment pretty well. Just a couple of final thoughts here on grass mixes. Again, didn't talk much about warm seasons, but here's a potential warm season mix for limited or full irrigation situations on the west slope. Your big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, and side oats grama. Those would work very well on the west slope. Again, if you're in a totally dryland situation looking to establish a dryland pasture, don't have any water at all, I would really consider using a more complex mixture of native species. The seed cost is going to be higher, it's going to be slower to establish, but because they are adapted to the environment, the longevity is typically going to be better. So John asked me to talk just a minute about irrigation considerations, and I'll finish up on this. With the drought and limited water availability, there's kind of two approaches that you can think about. One's called deficit irrigation. This is primarily used in the production of grain crops because we kind of stress the plant until the critical growth stages, when it's trying to set the seed and produce the seed. So we're trying to maximize the amount of grain production per inch of water, and rather than total trying to maximize total yield. The one that really works for forage production situations is what we call partial season irrigation. This is where we typically fully irrigate the crop through part of the season, and then we shut the water off and let the plants basically kind of go dormant or semi-dormant for the rest of the season. Works really well for alfalfa because it has that deep tap root. You can tap into water deeper in the soil profile. Again, alfalfa is adapted to those really dry, droughty conditions. It can really go dormant in the summertime period. It doesn't have water, and it will recover very well the next spring when the water is applied. The grasses, on the other hand, they have a shallower root system. Most of the grass plants' roots in that top 2 feet of soil, and so the grasses aren't quite as conducive. But again, there are some species like the wheat grasses and the wild rye, some of those ones that are adapted to that limited irrigation or drier type situations. These do fairly well and do stand up pretty well for with this limited irrigation, partial season irrigation type of approach. Some of the plants like the orchard grass doesn't do very well. Tall fescue doesn't do very well if it's not irrigated through the middle part of the summer. So in some of these, we'll see the stands start to decline over time if we stress them too much for too many years in a row. So with that, I'll leave you with the thought for the day, and I think hopefully we have a few minutes for questions here.
Great, Joe. That was a really good presentation. So let's go ahead and get some questions from folks, and we'll start going through that stuff. All right, Joe, we got a question. We're just going to do it over the microphone. Are you recommending a minimum number of soil samples to take in a given area?
Oh, for soil samples, typically, if the field is fairly consistent, there's not a lot of variability, 12 to 15 soil samples, 6 inches deep or so, and mix those all together and send that to the lab. Should do a pretty good job of telling you what what's in your soil, some of those things that I talked about. A lot of variability. You might want to sample, those areas separately. Low-lying areas versus, hillside areas, those types of things.
Yeah, earlier we pointed out that web soil survey, and one of the things we like to see with that is that, we understand some of the different soils we have and try and lump things together. And then if you have, a 10 or 15 acre pasture, we would probably, keep that as one unit and sample throughout that. Once you start getting past a large acreage, you start really getting too much into the equation there.
Yep.
Yes, we've got about a 10-year-old hayfield, about 4 acres, and are wondering, does that stand? Of course, it ages, but should we be flipping out the grass for another crop? Tilling it up and doing anything different to, increase its growth?
Do you know what was planted there originally?
I can't remember. I think orchard grass sounds familiar. I know we have red clover.
Probably some brome.
Yeah, I think there's a brome in there too. That I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to make that kind of a recommendation without actually seeing the field. But if you got good ground cover, I would be hesitant maybe to completely renovate, plow it completely up and start over. Sometimes if it's like smooth brome that's kind of gotten sod bound a little bit, you can run a kind of a ripper type apparatus through there to kind of break up those rhizomes and kind of stimulate some production on that. A lot of times it's nitrogen level that is kind of your main limiting factor on those older stands. They just kind of become stagnant over time, and a lot of that is nutrient levels and primarily nitrogen and maybe phosphorus.
Yeah, and I think in a season like this where, we potentially could be going into some more drought weather and with what we came out of last year, just being real careful with how we go through the process, and we're happy to help you kind of look over some of those things. So Isaac, do you have any questions out of the Montrose office down there? Did you hear that, Joe?
No, I didn't catch that.
I was just wondering what the the lifespan of sandfoin is.
It's highly variable.
Yeah.
A lot of that is how it's managed, how it's been managed, and the soil type, the irrigation management if it's irrigated. I say it doesn't like wet feed at all. So if it's over irrigated or a soil that's heavy textured soil that holds a lot of water, it doesn't do well in those types of situations. Sometimes it's 3 to 5 years, and sometimes I've seen fields that have been in for 20 years. So a lot of it's management, a lot of it's soils, and the environmental conditions of where it's being grown. It's hard to make a good call on that one.
Yeah, and I think that one thing to consider too is those first couple of years of crops like that, they really produce a lot more and taper over time. And so putting in proper management and how we affect that is really going to help to kind of give us a little, but what, Joe, you probably say that alfalfa is really not going to be doing much of anything in most irrigated situations after probably a 10-year period, right?
Well, I mean, it's definitely going to decline in the number of plants, but in a grass legume mix, it can still be contributing significantly to the production and quality of that hay. In a grass legume mix, in a straight stand, yeah, after 10 years, it's probably pretty much about played out. So.
Great. I did notice a question from Isaac, and I think the best way to go about answering that question is to check out that webinar we did on renovation of our pasture grasses just a couple months back. So if you have any specific question for Joe, we could go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we're pretty much out of time. So let's see what Isaac's got for this question, and we'll kind of go from there. But we really appreciate it, Joe. I think we got a lot out of it from this side, from you being able to help recommend to these folks some good practices for their pasture grasses for sure.
Yeah, hopefully I took a little longer than I thought I was going to take.
No, we're good. We left a little time in here. So Isaac does ask a little more specific question. What kind of cover crop do you recommend for an orchard to control weeds?
So something like to plant between the trees, I assume that's what he's talking about.
I would guess so.
Oh, I guess it kind of depends on what you want, but sometimes like those clovers, like the red, not the red, but the white clover, or even the strawberry clover, the low-growing clovers make pretty good cover crops in some of those orchards. That is going to fix some nitrogen, so I guess you have to take that into consideration if the particular trees or whatever need nitrogen. Let's see.
And I think a lot of situations we see here in our area up this way are alfalfas and the clovers mainly, but there is a lot of work being done in this kind of soil health avenue, talking about, mixing a lot of different things in there. And we're actually going to do some more things out here on the west side about, some of the soil health stuff. But typically what we're seeing is the alfalfas and the clovers.
All right, how often do you irrigate a pasture? Again, that's going to kind of depend on the soil type. The heavier clay soils are going to hold more water. The coarser textured sandy soils, we're probably going to have to irrigate a little more often, but not quite as much at a time. Probably every 10 days to 2 weeks is probably going to be adequate for most of the pastures. Probably 10 days over in that country be pretty good average.
Yeah, I think questions like that we're really happy to help out with, specifically with being able to work with you one-on-one at that kind of level on giving you some tips on how to do that for your particular site and soil, meeting the needs of your crops and producing something that's not going to hurt your pocket or going to be taking too much time off of you. So I think that's about all we got for you right now, Joe. Maybe Isaac's got one more, but we'll see what he's got to type in there. But really do appreciate you helping us out from the other side of the hill. I think that everybody got a pretty good deal of information out of that. Everybody's shaking their head on this side. So we really appreciate helping us out with this.
You bet. And his last question there is, I'm not sure on that one. So how do you control plantain in a pasture?
Well, that really is going to depend on what kind of mix you have in that pasture, and we have some recommendations on how to deal with that. So we can help a little more one-on-one with that deal. But I think that's going to wrap it up for us here tonight with Joe. Again, really want to thank you, Joe, for coming out and, luckily not having to make the trip over then by the wires. So I think this worked out pretty nice, although you're missing some beautiful weather on this side of the hill today.
It's raining over here right now, so.
We could use some more of that. So, but anyway, thank you so much, Joe. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to doing some more of this in the future.
Great, sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you.